let me elaborate a little bit on what Greg was suggesting, on how I came to issues of justice. I did not come to issues of justice because it was part of what I was assigned to teach or reading or anything like that. It was more that the issues came to me. First went like this. I was teaching at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In September 1975, I was sent by my college to a conference on Christian higher education from around the world, which was held in Potchefstroom, South Africa. Potchefstroom is a smallish city, about an hour's drive from Johannesburg, sorry. At this conference there were, South Africa in those days was divided up into what they called whites and coloreds and blacks. That was the terminology used. So there were so-called white South Africans there, mainly Afrikaners, but some of them English, and so-called blacks and so-called coloreds. There were people from other parts of Africa. There were a lot of Dutchmen, and some of us North Americans. The Dutch Afrikaans, which is the language of, the Afrikaners in South Africa, is derived from Dutch. And though Afrikaans is quite a bit different from contemporary Dutch, each can understand the other if they speak their own language. So the Dutch were very angry. They were very well acquainted with apartheid. Some of you are apartheid is in the distant past for some of you. The Dutch were very well acquainted with apartheid and were very angry. And though the conference was not about apartheid, they grabbed every opening they could find to vent their anger at the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners, in turn, seized every opportunity that they could find to vent their anger at the Dutch for being so angry at them and for being so judgmental and so forth. And so it went for a day and a half until neither party had anything to say to the other anymore. Actually, they hadn't had anything to say for about a half a day already, but anyway, they kept talking for half a day, and so then the so-called blacks and coloreds from South Africa got up and began to talk about the indignities that were daily heaped upon them and issued a cry for justice. I shall never forget it. The response of the Afrikaners took me completely aback. The Afrikaners said, justice is not the issue. Benevolence is the issue. And we Afrikaners are a very benevolent people. Some of us have large houses, and there are blacks in the backyard, families, and we give them Christmas gifts. We give them clothing that our own children have outworn. So we're generous. And apartheid itself has to be understood as benevolence, as generosity. There are, depends on how you count, some 10 or 11 different nationalities in South Africa. Depends on whether you count the Afrikaners and the English as one or two nationalities, but 10 or 11. And we think, so the Afrikaners, that each of these nationalities should find its own identity. Its culture, its linguistic identity, its cultural identity, and so forth. But if these different nationalities are to find their own identity, they've got to be pulled apart, right? So that's apartheid. Benevolence, justice is not the issue. We are a benevolent people. And here's what I thought I saw. Here's what I know I saw. Benevolence being used as an instrument of oppression. Shall never forget it. I then did what academic people do. I bought yards of books, became acquainted with both with blacks and coloreds and whites, and went back to South Africa several times, and so forth. The second episode that Greg hinted at was this. In May of 1976, I was invited to a conference on Palestinian human rights on the west side of Chicago. I was living in Grand Rapids, Michigan, so to get to the west side of Chicago is a fairly easy 3-hour drive. I have no idea why I was invited to the conference. I never really understood what it is in myself that led me to go to the conference, but I went. There were about 150 Palestinians there, almost all of them, maybe all of them, Christian. I had not thought of Palestinians as Christians. I suppose if you'd asked me, I would have said, well, yeah, I'm sure that there are some Christian Palestinians, but I thought of them as Muslim. But here were 150 Christian Palestinians. And once again, they issued a call for justice, and they poured out their guts in language that I subsequently learned is, for lots of North Americans, just too hot to handle. A passionate call for justice. There were many things about the conference that took me utterly aback. A representative of the PLO, there was a PLO, this was when we still had the PLO before there was a Palestinian administration actually. There was a representative from the PLO who was allowed by the State Department to come to this conference under the stipulation that he see to it that no more than 5 people at a single time could hear him talk. And I thought, if our policy is so fragile that if Terzi gets up and, you name it, 8 people hear him talk, that the State Department revokes his permission to be there. There's something profoundly wrong about it. So once again, I was confronted by my fellow Christians by a call for justice. So here we go. So I did the usual thing, bought yards of books, visited the Middle East several occasions, became chair of the organization that had sponsored this original conference, and so forth. So you see the point. I didn't seek this awakening. It happened to me. In both cases, my experience, I concluded that I could only put my experience in classic Protestant terms. I was confronted by a call from God to speak up for these suffering people in whatever way was appropriate. That it would be deeply religiously irresponsible of me not to do so. So that's what I did. And, you know, I've sort of a long book on justice out there, actually 2 of them, kind of thick and so forth. You might wonder, how does this constitute speaking up for these wronged people? But that's what's behind it all. So that's what's, if it had not been for those 2 speeches, for those 2 experiences, I'm not sure that the theme of justice in Scripture would have jumped out at me the way it did after those 2 experiences. So I understand that as part of your mission month, you're concentrating on poverty. So this is providentially directly relevant to you people here. So here's the question that I'd like you to think about with me. What is the moral significance of poverty? What are the moral categories that we should use when thinking about people who are impoverished? And what are the moral categories we should use in thinking about our response to their situation? I should make clear that I'm not talking about those who for religious reasons, let's say, are voluntarily poor, who adopt poverty as a way of life as part of a monastic community or something like that. So that's off to the side. What are the moral categories that we should use? Not infrequently one hears it said about such people that they're lazy and don't want to work. Now when that's said, it's assumed, of course, that they should not be lazy and that they ought to want to work. So the moral category being used in those cases, either explicitly or explicitly, the moral category is that of guilt. The poor person is guilty for being lazy and for not wanting to work. If that's one's view of the poor person, that the basic category to use is that they're guilty for being lazy and not wanting to work, if that's the right moral category to use, then obviously the appropriate moral response on our part is to exhort the person to get to work. And if after our preachments and our exhortations and you really ought to get to work and so forth, if after all that he still doesn't want to work, then it's appropriate, I suppose, to pressure him and maybe even exert some punishment or hard treatment of some sort. My ear tells me that that's how some, at least, of our politicians think about the matter. Some of them have declared themselves opposed to unemployment benefits because they say the money that people get from unemployment benefits is more than available jobs would pay, so they calculate, so they decide not to go to work and instead get more money from unemployment benefits. So unemployment benefits encourage and reward laziness. What's being assumed here, of course, is that for all these unemployed people, there are jobs, in fact, available. Well, okay, so that's one common way of thinking about the poor. They're lazy. Unemployment benefits make it worse. They're guilty. A couple of things in reply. First, of course it's true that some poor people are lazy. Of course it's true, and don't want to work. But I would have thought that poor people do not have a monopoly on laziness. I have the impression that a fair number, at least, of wealthy people are also lazy and don't much like to work. And that a good many of them manage either to stop working at an early age, or in case their wealth is inherited, basically they manage never to work at all. So if the social evil on which one has one's eye is guilty of being lazy and not wanting to work, then one had better be just as denunciatory of the wealthy lazy as of the poor lazy. Secondly, anybody who knows poor people, and as you're going to discover, or, well, I mean, you know already, it's preposterous to declare that poor people in general are poor because they're lazy and because they try to avoid working. Some desperately want to find work and can't find it. Some work for very little financial reward. I grew up in the farm country of southwest Minnesota, a tiny little farming village of 200 people. My parents were very poor. We just scraped by. But nobody thought that that was because my parents were lazy and tried to avoid work. In fact, basically my mother and father worked from, as I remember it now, from dawn to dusk. Sundays was a rest day, but otherwise every day was a work day from 6 in the morning, you name it, until whatever. Second, I think more common than the view that the poor are guilty because they're lazy and that we should treat them as such, probably more common is the view that they are unfortunate. They're poor because of too little or too much rain, because of bad farming practices inherited from their predecessors, because of poor education, because of an economic recession resulting in loss of jobs, because the breadwinner in the family has died, all kinds of unfortunate things, okay? On this way of thinking, the poor are not guilty, right? They're unfortunate. They're victims of big social, ecological happenings. They're among the social unfortunates. It's unfortunate that some people are poor, just as it's unfortunate that some are lame and deaf or blind. And of course, being unfortunate is just not a moral category. It's a purely factual category, right? Now, if one's basic category for thinking of the poor is that of unfortunates, then I think one or the other of the following two responses is invariably forthcoming. One response is this: there's basically nothing to be done about it. It's unfortunate, but there's nothing to do about it, or at least there's nothing to do about it that won't make things worse than they are already. Nothing to be done about it other than to pray that God will deliver them from their unfortunate condition. Right? It's unfortunate that there are poor people, but you've heard it, New Testament quotation, the poor we always have with us. So nothing much to do about it. So that's a non-moral response to a non-moral understanding of the situation. Unfortunate, nothing to be done about it. There are no moral categories being involved there. That's one response to understanding the poor as unfortunates. The other response to the understanding the poor as suffering from misfortune, the other response is the response of charity. Charity obviously being a good thing to do. Those of us with resources should alleviate the condition of the unfortunate poor. We should extend charity to them. That's how most people in the world, and I think they were right about it, that's how most people in the world understood the response of governments and of NGOs to the earthquake in Haiti, right? That this was charity being extended to people who suffered the misfortune of this calamitous earthquake. Though I read recently that only about 10% of the promised charity has come through to Haiti. I don't know firsthand whether that's true or not. It's my impression, how about you? It's my impression that probably most Christian relief, development, and service organizations think of themselves as charitable organizations. Charity is the basic moral category that they use. For them, the moral significance of poverty and of other kinds of misfortune is that the poor are candidates for charity. And it's likewise my impression that most Americans in general, if they don't think of the poor as guilty of being lazy, think of them as unfortunates who are candidates for charity. And we then get into big arguments, you've heard them, we then get into big arguments over whether the government should or should not be in the business of extending charity. Some people say it should, some people say it should not. We assume that government welfare programs are charity, and some of us then argue that that's a good thing. After all, we Americans are a generous people and we want to provide a safety net, as it's called. And others argue that, you've heard it, that charity is simply not the business of government. It's the business of individuals and it's the business of churches like you and so forth, but it's not government business. Okay. Now, if one thinks of aid to the poor as charity extended to the unfortunate, then four things typically come along. First, one will think of what one is doing as over and above the call of duty. Charity goes beyond duty, right? It's an act of grace on your part. It's a display of generosity. It's a gift, if it's charity. Second, since it's a gift rather than a duty, it's morally optional whether you will extend charity or not. If something goes beyond duty, if it's duty, you ought to do it. If it goes beyond duty, well, then it's up to you whether you're going to do it or not. Third, if you think of it as charity, you're going to expect gratitude from the recipients. That's what we pretty much all expect when we give a gift, right? Some indication of gratitude, perhaps combined with praise for our generous character. Everybody here, I feel sure in saying, has felt annoyed and aggrieved when you gave a gift to somebody and they expressed just no gratitude for it whatsoever. Acted as if they had it coming. Right? It's annoying. And fourth, if it's a gift, if it's charity, if it's a gift, you're free to condition the giving of the gift on good behavior. Since it's optional, you can say or think, I'm not going to give it to you until you shape up and start acting better. These are features of charity. It's optional. You can condition it. You don't have to give it. You expect some gratitude. It's a good thing on your part, and so forth. So to pull it together so far, what we have so far is this. I take it. Some people, when they think of the poor, use as their basic category the moral category of guilt. The poor are guilty of being lazy and not wanting to work. And the morally appropriate response to that is get to work. Shape up, get to work, and put some pressure on them to do that, and so forth. Other people, when they think of the poor, don't think in terms of guilt so much, but think in terms of misfortune or unfortunate, which is a non-moral category. And then you can either say, yeah, it's too bad, but there's basically nothing to be done about it, or nothing that won't make things worse, or you'll say, let's extend some charity. Let's be good and extend some charity. So that's, you remember now what I said at the beginning, that's how the Afrikaners were thinking of what they were doing. They were being charitable, giving gifts and trinkets to the kids in their backyards. Incidentally, some people at the conference were extremely skeptical of these stories. I was not skeptical. I believe that the Afrikaners, who had large houses and servants in the backyard, were in fact handing down their children's clothing. I mean, it seems plausible to me, doesn't it to you? And we're giving small Christmas gifts and so forth, so it didn't seem to me implausible. I mean, the business about apartheid being an act of benevolence and charity, that did seem to me wildly implausible. But so two ways of thinking about the poor. Now a third way. Very different from those two ways of thinking. And let me introduce this third way by reading a few passages from the Christian church fathers, your and my and ancestors, Christian ancestors from the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th century, 3rd and the 4th century actually after Christ. Would have been nice if I'd had these on a sheet of paper for you, but I'll read them. Here goes. The first one comes from one of the fathers writing in Greek, Basil of Caesarea in present-day Turkey. Basil lives from 330 to 379. This is what Basil says. Will not one be called a thief who steals the garment of one already clothed? And is one deserving of any other title than thief, who will not clothe the naked if he is able to do so? That bread which you keep belongs to the hungry. That coat which you preserve in your wardrobe belongs to the naked. Those shoes which are rotting in your possession belong to the shoeless. That gold which you have hidden in the ground belongs to the needy. Wherefore, as often as you were able to help others and refused, so often did you wrong them. That's pretty startling language. Here's what one of the fathers writing in Latin, Ambrose, who was bishop up in the northern Italian city of Milan. This is a brief one. Not from your own do you bestow upon the poor man, but you return from him what is his. You return to the poor man what is his. And now here's at greater length from John Chrysostomos, 347 to 407. Chrysostomos was one of the great preachers of the Eastern Church, a fiery preacher. He criticized the empress for her jewelry, and whereupon the empress booted him out of Constantinople, and he spent the remainder of his life in Antioch. He's preaching a series of 7 sermons on the parable of Lazarus. This is what I'm going to read you comes from the first sermon. He begins these just before No, I think he preaches the first one just after New Year's. And he says, I notice that you people seem a bit sleepy this morning, but let me preach anyway. And then he finishes his fifth sermon and says, I notice that you people are getting a bit bored with these sermons on Lazarus, so I'll interrupt for a few weeks and then I'll come back. My feeling is, so what's new? Here's John. Now you got to visualize him as standing in the great church, and it wasn't before the present great church, but standing in the great church in Constantinople, probably the emperor and the empress and so forth. Here he goes. This also is theft, not to share one's possessions. Perhaps this statement seems surprising to you, but do not be surprised. I shall bring you testimony from the divine scripture, saying that not only the theft of other people's goods, but also the failure to share one's own goods with other is theft and swindle and fraud. The rich man is a kind of steward of the money which is owed for distribution to the poor. He is directed to distribute it to his fellow servants who are in want. So if he spends more on himself than his need requires, he will pay the harshest penalty hereafter. For his own goods are not his own, but belong to his fellow human beings. The poor man, says John, the poor man has but one plea, his want and his standing in need. Don't require anything else from him. But even if he is the most wicked of all people and is at a loss for his necessary sustenance, let us free him from hunger. The almsgiver, now he uses a nautical metaphor of, the almsgiver is a harbor for those in necessity. A harbor receives all who have encountered shipwreck and frees them from danger, escorts them into its own shelter. And so you likewise, when you see on earth the human being who encountered the shipwreck of poverty, don't judge him. Don't seek an account of his life, but free him from his misfortune. Need alone is the poor man's worthiness. We don't provide for the manners, but for the man. We show mercy to him not because of his virtue, but because of his misfortune, in order that we ourselves may receive from our divine master his great mercy. I beg you remember this without fail, that not to share our own wealth with the poor is theft from the poor and deprivation of their means of life. We don't possess our own wealth, but theirs. You can understand why the well-to-do in Constantinople were annoyed with John. So I'm sure, what do you think? I'm sure that Basil, Ambrose, I could read you lots of other passages from the church fathers to the same effect. I'm sure that Basil, Ambrose, and John believed that some of the poor were poor because they were lazy, guilty of being lazy, and that they ought to be treated as such. I mean, they don't happen to say that here, but I'm just absolutely sure of that. And the concept of charity was, of course, I'm sure part of their, you can find that in other passages, not here, but other passages, that they knew about charity, that they had that concept. But did you notice that they don't preach guilt to the poor here, nor do they preach charity to the well-to-do? They didn't say to the wealthy, be good, be charitable, and so forth. Here's what they say. Did you catch it? The extra shoes in the closet of the well-to-do person belong to the poor person who has no shoes. Belong to. That the extra food in the cupboard of the well-to-do person belongs to the poor person who has no food, and so forth. That's part of your and my Christian heritage. To put it in terminology that you and I are familiar with, though terminology that I discover some people don't like, the poor person has a right to those shoes and to that food. Because if something belongs to you, then you've got a right to it. And furthermore, it's what philosophers and so forth call a natural right. None of these three people appeal to the laws of the surrounding society. There's no reference to the laws of Constantinople whatsoever. It's just, they come as human beings, just says John. Basil puts it from the negative side, from the dark side. Not only do the extra shoes of the well-to-do person belong to the person who has no shoes, if the well-to-do person doesn't give the poor person shoes, then the well-to-do person wrongs the poor person. So I call that putting it from the shadow side. Wrongs the person. Look, if you deprive somebody of what they've got a right to, you wrong them. But the same point can be put more positively by using the concept of justice. If you've got a right to be being treated a certain way by me, then if I don't treat you that way, I'm not treating you as justice requires. I fail to do what justice demands. And so for these three church fathers, here's what I'd like you to think about with me. For these three church fathers, the fundamental moral significance of poverty, there will be exceptions, but the fundamental moral significance is that it issues to us a call to do justice. Like it or not, this is part of your and my Christian heritage. Yep, sometimes the poor are lazy, maybe quite often. And yes, sometimes there's nothing to be done about poverty. That's true. But in the normal case, the moral significance of poverty is that it presents us with a call to do justice. So where did this way of thinking come from? This way of thinking about the moral significance of poverty. Did Basil, Ambrose, John, and the other church fathers just invent it, dream it up? Or did they sort of absorb it from their surrounding pagan society? Maybe you heard it in the passage from Chrysostomos. It comes from the Bible. The passage that I read you from John Chrysostomos leaves off. It begins with, as you just heard from the scripture reading and so forth. So the category, let me put it before you, the category that scripture uses almost all the time for the moral significance of poverty is the category of justice. Almost all the time. The impoverished present us with a call to do justice. I could give you probably a couple hundred passages to that effect. Let me tonight content myself with just two of them. Here's one from Psalm 72. The psalmist is describing the good king, the ideal king. Here's what he says. He's addressing God, actually. May the king judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the king defend the cause of the poor of the people and give deliverance to the needy and crush the oppressor. So notice, the king, in defending the cause of the poor and giving deliverance to the needy, is fulfilling his mandate to do justice. Nothing is said about charity, nothing is said about guilt, and so forth. So the church fathers were basically echoing that idea. Now let me just take one other passage. This is from the beginning of Isaiah 10, the first two verses. Woe to those who enact evil statutes and to those who constantly record unjust decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and to rob the poor of my people of their rights. So lots of passages to that effect. So here are three ways of thinking about the moral significance of poverty. They're guilty, nothing to be done about them, and coming out of the church fathers, and they are reflecting your and my scriptures. The poor, most of the time, are being treated unjustly. To come to their aid is not to extend optional charity, it's to, as all three of Ambrose, Gregory, and Basil, and John say, it's to give them what belongs to, return to them what belongs to them. Now that leaves open So that's how we should respond to understand the moral significance of their condition. That leaves open how Scripture understands their condition as such. That's our response. Our response is to treat them as justice requires. But how about their situation as such? Does Scripture understand the poor as unfortunates? Does it group them with those who have a broken ankle, had a stroke, heart attack, unfortunates? Well, you may have noticed that John Chrysostom did speak of poverty as misfortune. But the biblical writers don't speak that way very often. I mean, if asked, I'm sure they'd say that, yeah, sometimes there are droughts and it's unfortunate that people are impoverished and so forth, sure. But that's not how they usually talk about it. What they usually do is group the impoverished with three other groups of unfortunates, three other groups of vulnerable people: the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the impoverished. Over and over in the New Testament, that quartet of what I call the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the impoverished. And here's what's really striking, and for all of us unsettling. Scripture almost always describes them as downtrodden. We in our society often use a sort of circular metaphor. They're peripheral. They're on the margins. It's much more typical of Scripture to talk about them as downtrodden. And what that suggests, obviously, is that the impoverishment on which the biblical writers have their eye is not something that just befalls people, but is the result of unjust social laws and practices. Not only are we treating the poor unjustly if we fail to alleviate their condition, but their condition itself is often, typically, an indication of injustice, of being pushed down, downtrodden. And what that implies, obviously, is that not only does justice require that we alleviate the condition of the poor, it obviously implies that what we have to do is try to change the structures and the practices that press them down. In short, let me sum it up. I think for the biblical writers, it's clear that the moral significance of poverty, in the usual case, is that it represents a double violation of justice. The poor are unjustly downtrodden. In our failure to do anything about it, we once again treat them unjustly. So the moral significance of poverty in Scripture, for the most part, is not that the poor are guilty of being lazy or that they're just unfortunate, but that they're victims of injustice and that something is required of us and not optional charity. One last point. Recall once more the verse that I read from Psalm 72. What we heard is that it's the responsibility of the king, the government, to see to it that justice is rendered to the poor. And what Scripture teaches in general about government is that its business is to secure justice. Romans 13. The business of government is to secure justice, punish wrongdoing, encourage right doing. Runs throughout Scripture. The basic business of government is to secure justice. May not be the only business, but basic business. So when we put these two together, I, as a biblical Christian, find it impossible to avoid the conclusion that government has a responsibility with respect to the condition of the poor, has a responsibility to see to it that they are treated with justice. It's open for discussion as to how government is going to achieve that goal. That's open for discussion. Okay? I think what's not open for discussion on biblical Christianity is that injustice is typically, poverty is typically an effective injustice, and it's the business of government to see to it that there's justice in society. Once again, it may be that handing out doles is one of the worst ways for government to see to it that justice is rendered to the poor, but it has to see to it that it is. So I think applications for our situation are so clear and obvious that it would be sort of overkill to speak at length about them. But I'll take one that I know is controversial. Over the past 3 years, we in the United States have had, shall I say, an intense debate about the availability of health care to citizens in general. And all kinds of categories have been used for talking about that. To my ear, the main categories have been the categories of freedom and cost. I've been astonished at how seldom, to my ear, moral categories were used in the discussion. Maybe I missed something, but freedom, you're compromising my freedom if you make me buy health insurance, and cost, the present system is just too expensive. I think it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that Scripture urges you and me to raise the question of justice when thinking and talking about health care. Not that issues of freedom are irrelevant, not that issues of cost are irrelevant, but issues of justice. I think you and I are compelled to ask whether in a wealthy and technologically sophisticated society such as ours, the poor have a right to decent health care. Does justice require this, or is it optional charity? And if justice requires it, then we have to ask, what should government do about it? Once again, what it should do is up for discussion. It's been my impression that, as I said, that very few people, very few of us, have been using the category of justice, or indeed any moral category, in discussing the issue of health care. So let me close with that. I told you what opened my eyes to issues of justice, those two experiences with the so-called blacks and coloreds in South Africa and the Christian Palestinians there on the west side of Chicago. I suppose if you'd asked me before those two experiences, does the Bible talk about justice? I suppose I would have said, well, yeah, but didn't jump out. Those two experiences made it jump out. I now think that justice is written into the very fabric of Scripture, and that what it urges you and me to do is to recognize that the involuntarily impoverished are issuing to you and me a call to treat them justly. Thanks.
What do we gain by labeling a moral imperative as justice versus charity? If I have a non-optional obligation to look after the poor, then what do we gain by labeling it as charity or justice? That is, one might think that I have an obligation to be charitable to the poor. What is the difference between saying this obligation is a matter of charity and saying it is a matter of justice, especially if we claim that the relevant actions are morally obligatory and not merely optional?
I would say that the question sort of, this isn't a very nice thing to say, the question sort of answers itself. Charity, what I mean by it, what anybody means by it, charity goes beyond the obligatory. You can mean other things by charity, but goes beyond the obligatory. Whereas justice is what's required of us. And so Christian relief organizations, you can think of them then in two ways. I think classically they've been thought of as charitable organizations. I think many of them are in fact engaged in justice. So you people are involved in the International Justice Mission, right? Now that's a very clear, International Justice Mission is very clear that what they're doing is, maybe some of it is charity, but what they're doing is rendering justice to children and women especially they do a bit more than this, but they concentrate on who are enslaved, sex slaves, work slaves, and so forth. I think the title of IJM is the right title. This is not an optional thing for you and me to do, but insofar as we can do anything about it, it's a call. It's our obligation. Justice asks it of us. Whereas charity, you can choose who you're going to be charitable to. If your church has a benevolence fund, in my denomination, it was traditionally called the benevolence fund, and you can decide to whom to give benevolence, of course. I mean, well, why not? Or in fact, whether to give it. So I think the basic difference is right there. And what struck me then in these church fathers when I first read them, I mean, look, when I first read these church fathers, I was sort of open because of this experience in South Africa and the experience with the Palestinians on the west side of Chicago. But this was jolting. I mean, these three, Basil, Ambrose, Chrysostomos, saying that those extra shoes belong to the poor person. That's strong language. It's not John saying to the wealthy people, it'd be a good thing if you gave these your extra shoes. Be a noble thing. They belong. So that's, the question sort of contains, I think, the crucial distinction.
Why don't we go to, is there a question on the floor that somebody would like to ask? Yes.
I was curious, I guess this question is related to the first, but looks at the other part of the moral significance, so misfortune versus downtrodden. And part of this, I'm just wondering about the practical significance. But I guess I would have thought the poor is unfortunate, just as I would have thought the widows, maybe it was injustice that killed their husband, but maybe it was just bad circumstances. But I guess my question is, I would have thought misfortune could generate duties. So I walk by someone who's drowning. It's not just that it would be a nice thing if I helped them, it would be, but I owe it to them and they can exact it from me from a kind of way. So I'm wondering if, I guess I'm really thinking about this question more practically speaking, is there really kind of a practically significant difference in thinking of the poor is unfortunate, because that can generate duties, versus downtrodden? I'm wondering if you think that will really affect our practices as Christians.
Yes, good question. So what I said is that it's one way in which people often think about the moral significance of poverty is they are unfortunates. And then I mentioned two responses, fairly characteristic responses. Sometimes there's nothing to be done about it, or at least nothing that won't make things worse. And the other is, let's be charitable. But I think you're absolutely right that very often, and that it seemed to me was the language that was used for Haitian relief. It was charity. But you're absolutely right. Misfortune may generate obligation, absolutely. And I would just be wronging the person if, they'd been hit by a car and had the misfortune of being hit by a car on the street in LA somewhere, and I just walked past. Of course that'd be wrong. Yep, you're absolutely right. So I could, in talking about thinking of them as unfortunate, have said that very often the right response will be a third response, not nothing to be done or let's be kind to them, but boy, I'm obligated to do something here. Absolutely.
Okay, I have the mic, so I get to ask a question. Okay, you spoke of the moral obligation, or the moral, a moral category of caring for the poor. One issue I know that many of us struggle with, because it's in the news today, what happens to the moral category of people who have violated a particular law of the United States to immigrate here illegally? Is there then still a moral obligation to care for them if they are in this country illegally?
So I have not thought through the right response, the right detailed response to the problems of immigration. I have not been a politician running for office who would be compelled to think it all through. But it does seem to me that what you and I have to constantly keep in mind is they may have broken some law. Okay, and that's not insignificant. Business of government is, to establish a code of laws and so forth so as to secure justice. But they're human beings, created in God's image. And it seems to me we've always got to keep that in mind. We may not treat them with indignity. Now, what that involves about amnesty, going back home and getting back in an immigration line, I don't know about all that. I mean, it'd be nice if I did, but I don't.
I did see another hand back here, and I'll walk back.
I was wondering if you could speak on the concept of justice and reintegrating the idea of love with justice, because is there a way in which, if we think of justice apart from love, that just as just purely moral obligation, that it could potentially be litigious without love? Is the question clear, or?
How long a speech should I give? I mean, that's a really important question, I think. So let me give a slightly lengthy answer. Coming down to us from the ancients, from the ancient world, are two great imperatives from Jesus and Old Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself. Both from ancient pagan thought and from Scripture, do justice. Two great imperatives. And it's not the least bit obvious, of course, on the face of it, how those two imperatives relate to each other, which is why the question arises. I would say that most discussions in the West about the relationship between love and justice see them as in some way in tension with each other or as pitted against each other. And the classic literary expression of that is, of course, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, in which you've got justice and mercy in conflict with each other, right? But that's one example of the basic theme. You find it in the theologians, the philosophers. So the question for you and me to ask is this, or here's one of the questions to ask. When Jesus said, when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, the second and the greatest commandment, like unto the first, is love your neighbor as yourself. What did Jesus mean by love? And the standard view is the love there is a love that goes beyond what justice requires. That's been a standard view. To act out of love is not to act as you do because justice requires it, and if you do act as you do because justice requires it, you're not acting out of love. So the second love command is presented by Jesus and accepted by the questioners as the heart of the law, the Torah. But it's not just the heart of Torah, it is actually a quotation from Leviticus 19. So it seemed to me some years back when I became aware of that a helpful thing to do would be to look up Leviticus 19 and see what its context was, and maybe that would give us some illumination. So if you do look up Leviticus 19, what you find is a part of the law code that God is issuing to Israel through Moses. And this law, it's interwoven with issues of justice. To the landowners, don't go over your wheat fields a second time, but leave the grain that sort of fell down for the poor and so forth. That's an act of justice and so forth. So what you get in Leviticus 19 is a whole series of quite specific moral injunctions. Don't hold a grudge against your neighbor, for example. If your neighbor's done something wrong, reprove your neighbor lest his guilt be on your hand. I mean, a fascinating series of detailed injunctions. And then, at the culmination of it, and so, love your neighbor as yourself. So here's the moral to be taken from that. In its original context, justice was not seen as pitted against love, but justice was seen as among the examples of love. Not the only examples, but among the examples. So I think that you and I have to think of biblical love, New Testament love, as incorporating justice. The love that Jesus enjoins on us at least does justice. It does more than that, but it does that at least. That's how I've come to see. So I think they should be seen as locked together like that and not pitted against each other. I don't see any other way to read it. It's a context there in Leviticus 19.
Okay, let's take another question up on the screen. In the book When Helping Hurts by Corbett and Fickert, the author states that we are all poor. The fall affected us all. Some also are materially poor. The author states that all four relationships have been broken: our relationship with God, others, the earth, and with ourselves. One, would you agree that all are poor, just in different ways, and that the relationships listed above have all been broken because of the fall? Second, the author also claims some in North America have a God complex that separates and places us above the poor, thus hindering our effectiveness in ministering to the poor.
Good question. So my answer to the first, to the number one, is yes. But, so there is this haunting refrain over and over in the prophets, in the Psalms, in Deuteronomy, in the Torah, Pentateuch, first 5 books. When the authors mention justice, widows, orphans, aliens, and the impoverished, and I can't help but think that they meant literal widows, and literal orphans, and literal aliens, and literal impoverished. So in some sense, we're all poor, yeah. But what do you think? Widows, orphans, aliens, and the impoverished. In Psalm 8:72, when the king's business is to, render justice to the needy. It doesn't mean all of us, it means the needy. So in some deep sense, we're all poor, true, but there's this other sense, the social, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the impoverished. So I think that one thing that happens when we think of helping the poor as an act of charity on our part is that it does encourage an attitude of superiority. The Afrikaners felt superior to those to whom they were being benevolent. There was just no doubt about that. I think it's very difficult when you think in those ways not to think of yourself as superior. But if you think of yourself as in the way that Ambrose and Basil and John Chrysostomos were thinking, that you're giving the poor person what belongs to him or her, that does not encourage superiority feelings, does it? You're just... When I give a student, I'm teaching a class, and I give a student who's done a bang-up job in the class, and I give him or her an A, that doesn't make me feel superior to the student. It's just, I'm just giving her what she has a right to. So I think it's in answer to the two. I think it's the question two. I think it's attitude of superiority goes much more with thinking in terms of benevolence.
Dr. Wolterstorff, we have a question from the back now.
Yeah.
I'd like to preface this by saying this isn't a challenge. I appreciate what you're saying, but given the existence of a culture of poverty in which a sense of dependency, despair, and inferiority is prevalent among various downtrodden groups, do you have any thoughts on how you would deal with a situation where charity, which is meant to alleviate one of the injustices that you talked about, actually can contribute to this sense of despair and dependency that exists, which contributes therefore to the existence of poverty, which is the second injustice that you talked about. So in alleviating one injustice, you're actually reinforcing another.
So I think what you and I constantly have to think about as Americans and as Christian Americans is how to how to go towards curing exactly that mentality. You're absolutely right. That should be high on our agenda. Yep.
Okay, let's take
Now,
another...
not everybody poor has that culture of poverty mentality. My parents certainly didn't have that. They were poor. I knew that they were poor. No doubt they knew that they were poor, but it was a different mentality. But where that mentality is present, we should do all we can to correct it. Yep.
Let's take another question on the screen. Shall we allow government to be the primary giver in charitable means, or can the church fulfill that role, and in doing so build Christ's authority in charitable means?
I think the government should not think of itself I think the government should think of itself hardly at all in terms of charity. I think it should think of its biblical proclamation as government's business is justice. It's not to say they can't do some more, build some infrastructure, which maybe you can't quite argue for in terms of justice and so forth, you know. But the basic category is government should not basically be in the business of charity. It should be in the business of justice. Now, can the church fulfill that role? I think it'd be a wonderful thing if churches and synagogues and mosques were so effective in the United States that government said, there's no problem. There's just no problem with poverty. It's not a problem in the U.S. That'd be terrific, right? I think. But that's not how it is. So churches should no doubt be doing more than they can. But look, once upon a time when everybody in Western Europe, everybody in Western Europe was member of the church, charity could be basically in the hands of the bishops, not the government, but the bishops. That's how it was for many years. But given our pluralism, lots of Americans are not members of churches. That's not an option anymore.
Okay, there's a question here.
Hi. I have a practical question. With regard saying that it's robbing from the poor by not giving to them when you have the ability to, if I suspect or anticipate that a poor person might use money for something like drugs or other dental, I'm sorry? This is in regard to saying that you're robbing from the poor if you don't give when you have the ability to. If I suspect that they're going to use money for drugs or other detrimental activities, and I don't happen to have other things like shoes or clothes or blankets on me, how am I supposed to know when giving money to the poor is what actually is good for them?
We should do all we reasonably can to see to it that the money is not spent on drugs. When I was still teaching at Yale in New Haven, there was the policy of a lot of people of giving the beggars chits that could only be spent in a local restaurant or something like that. Instead of cash, just chits. And so that was a way of dealing with it. Also, there was a famous beggar in New Haven who, if you just gave him 50 cents, his response was, if that's all you can afford, you need it worse than I do.
Let's take another question on the screen.
So a sort of minimum contribution.
What do you make of the standard economic advice given for savings, putting away for retirement, etc.? Do you see this advice consistent or inconsistent with Christian charity and compassion for the poor?
So this is putting away, if I understand it, this is putting away money for one's own retirement. Do I think of that as charity or as compassion for the poor?
Is it inconsistent with it?
Inconsistent with it? I think of it as, I guess I think if you've got available money to put away for retirement, it's a responsibility on your part to do so. But I'm not sure that that's getting at the thrust of the question.
Yeah, I think the thrust would be that that with as much poverty that's around us that we see, is it inconsistent to think of oneself? Yeah.
Well, I mean, so if the choice is giving away, not putting away any money for retirement, but giving it to the poor, so what then happens to you when you are 65 or whatever? So I guess I haven't thought so much hard about it, but I think if you have the money, it's part of your responsibility to save for your retirement, old age. Maybe about one more?
Okay.
So What are your views on the commercialized approach in an attempt to alleviate poverty? A couple examples would be Product Red, the endeavors of Bono, the lead singer of U2. Do you believe that this approach helps resolve the double violation of injustice? There are a lot of organizations out there that try to raise money through selling certain products, Gap, Apple, in an attempt to raise money to alleviate poverty. Do you think that this approach actually works in alleviating the injustice of poverty?
So I think, so look, you heard me say two things. One, as I read, well, two things coming out of Scripture and going on into the Church Fathers. Justice is the business of government, and involuntary poverty is an issue of justice. But you heard me then say also that so in general, the government has to see to it that justice is done. But if justice is being done in some area with some respect or whatever, then government stays out of it. I mean, it's government's concern is taken care of. So I think you and I, in all kinds of ways, should be, in the ways that you mentioned and so forth, should be seeing to it that we carry out our God-given requirement to see that justice is done to the poor, all kinds of different ways. And so the ways you mentioned and lots of others. I think that government should be an issue of last resort. But it should be a resort.
Dr. Wolterstorff, let's take one more question from the back, and then I'll wrap it up.
But this man here has been really eager
Has he?
to ask it.
Sorry, Wayland. Okay, all right. He just gave up his question so that. Why don't you just go ahead and stand up and ask your question instead of me coming all the way over? Oh, you want the microphone? All right. Okay.
See, this was an act of charity on my part, right?
I think it was an act of justice, sir.
I see.
I'm just trying to unpack your personal views, and you seem to leave rhetorical opening for going either way on the answer to this question. And I'll preface it by saying I'm neither an economist nor a libertarian, so it's going to be asked in an amateur fashion. Alleviation of poverty over longer term, because I think it's important to talk about a temporal aspect, and the relationship of that to the creation of employment, the creation of jobs, and the responsibility of government in the act of justice to take acts that create jobs over the longer term. The coercive power of government to distribute money over the shorter term has been demonstrated over several centuries of economic thought to be found to be not conducive to the creation of long-term employment for people. Could you unpack your views on that aspect of long-term job creation as opposed to coercive dispersing of money over the shorter term and the effect that has on the creation of jobs in any society or culture?
So I think one of the ways in which government can exercise, one of the most basic ways in which government can exercise its responsibility in this area is to have policies that don't create but encourage employment over the long haul, jobs over the long haul. The right sort of policies for that. In the short fall, no government ever has been or ever will be wholly successful in that endeavor. No economy ever has been or will be wholly successful in that endeavor. And so there are always some who, well, because it's not wholly successful, there are some who don't have jobs. And government has to see to it, doesn't have to give a dole. Seems to me its responsibility to do justice is to see to it that those people are not just allowed to mold or to starve.
Can we give Dr. Wolterstorff another thank you?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.